the new god of evil, the new gods of evil, the new god of evil, the new goddess of evil, the new goddesses of evil, the new goddess of evil, the old god of evil, the old gods of evil, the old god of evil, the old goddess of evil, the old goddesses of evil, the old goddess of evil, the greater god of evil, the greater gods of evil, the greater god of evil, the greater goddess of evil, the greater goddesses of evil, the greater goddess of evil, the lesser god of evil, the lesser gods of evil, the lesser god of evil, the lesser goddess of evil, the lesser goddesses of evil, the lesser goddess of evil, the higher god of evil, the higher gods of evil, the higher god of evil, the higher goddess of evil, the higher goddesses of evil, the higher goddess of evil, the lower god of evil, the lower gods of evil, the lower god of evil, the lower goddess of evil, the lower goddesses of evil, the lower goddess of evil, the greater spirit of evil, the greater spirits of evil, the greater spirit of evil, the lesser spirit of evil, the lesser spirits of evil, the lesser spirit of evil, the higher spirit of evil, the higher spirits of evil, the higher spirit of evil, the lower spirit of evil, the lower spirits of evil, the lower spirit of evil, the major god of evil, the major gods of evil, the major god of evil, the major goddess of evil, the major goddesses of evil, the major goddess of evil, the minor god of evil, the minor gods of evil, the minor god of evil, the minor goddess of evil, the minor goddesses of evil, the minor goddess of evil, the superior god of evil, the superior gods of evil, the superior god of evil, the superior goddess of evil, the superior goddesses of evil, the superior goddess of evil, the inferior god of evil, the inferior gods of evil, the inferior god of evil, the inferior goddess of evil, the inferior goddesses of evil, the inferior goddess of evil, the ancestor god of evil, the ancestor gods of evil, the ancestor god of evil, the ancestor goddess of evil, the ancestor goddesses of evil, the ancestor goddess of evil, the ascendant god of evil, the ascendant gods of evil, the ascendant god of evil, the ascendant goddess of evil, the ascendant goddesses of evil, the ascendant goddess of evil, the descendant god of evil, the descendant gods of evil, the descendant god of evil, the descendant goddess of evil, the descendant goddesses of evil, the descendant goddess of evil, the transcendent god of evil, the transcendent gods of evil, the transcendent god of evil, the transcendent goddess of evil, the transcendent goddesses of evil, the transcendent goddess of evil, the past god of evil, the past gods of evil, the past god of evil, the past goddess of evil, the past goddesses of evil, the past goddess of evil, the present god of evil, the present gods of evil, the present god of evil, the present goddess of evil, the present goddesses of evil, the present goddess of evil, the future god of evil, the future gods of evil, the future god of evil, the future goddess of evil, the future goddesses of evil, the future goddess of evil, the authentic god of evil, the authentic gods of evil, the authentic god of evil, the authentic goddess of evil, the authentic goddesses of evil, the authentic goddess of evil, the synthetic god of evil, the synthetic gods of evil, the synthetic god of evil, the synthetic goddess of evil, the synthetic goddesses of evil, the synthetic goddess of evil, the progressive god of evil, the progressive gods of evil, the progressive god of evil, the progressive goddess of evil, the progressive goddesses of evil, the progressive goddess of evil, the regressive god of evil, the regressive gods of evil, the regressive god of evil, the regressive goddess of evil, the regressive goddesses of evil, the regressive goddess of evil, the ordinary god of evil, the ordinary gods of evil, the ordinary god of evil, the ordinary goddess of evil, the ordinary goddesses of evil, the ordinary goddess of evil, the extraordinary god of evil, the extraordinary gods of evil, the extraordinary god of evil, the extraordinary goddess of evil, the extraordinary goddesses of evil, the extraordinary goddess of evil, the static god of evil, the static gods of evil, the static god of evil, the static goddess of evil, the static goddesses of evil, the static goddess of evil, the dynamic god of evil, the dynamic gods of evil, the dynamic god of evil, the dynamic goddess of evil, the dynamic goddesses of evil, the dynamic goddess of evil, the land god of evil, the land gods of evil, the land god of evil, the land goddess of evil, the land goddesses of evil, the land goddess of evil, the sea god of evil, the sea gods of evil, the sea god of evil, the sea goddess of evil, the sea goddesses of evil, the sea goddess of evil, the sky god of evil, the sky gods of evil, the sky god of evil, the sky goddess of evil, the sky goddesses of evil, the sky goddess of evil, the god of evil, the gods of evil, the god of evil, the goddess of evil, the goddesses of evil, the goddess of evil, the half god of evil, the half gods of evil, the half god of evil, the half goddess of evil, the half goddesses of evil, the half goddess of evil, the vessel of evil, the vessels of evil, the vessel of evil, the name of evil, the names of evil, the name of evil, the person of evil, the persons of evil, the person of evil, the persona of evil, the personas of evil, the persona of evil, the personage of evil, the personages of evil, the personage of evil, the personality of evil, the personalities of evil, the personality of evil, the personification of evil, the personifications of evil, the personification of evil, the image of evil, the images of evil, the image of evil, the imagination of evil, the imaginations of evil, the imagination of evil, the belief of evil, the beliefs of evil, the belief of evil, the thought of evil, the thoughts of evil, the thought of evil, the word of evil, the words of evil, the word of evil, the action of evil, the actions of evil, the action of evil, the reaction of evil, the reactions of evil, the reaction of evil, the feeling of evil, the feelings of evil, the feeling of evil, the situation of evil, the situations of evil, the situation of evil, the circumstance of evil, the circumstances of evil, the circumstance of evil, the environment of evil, the environment of evil, the environment of evil, the relationship of evil, the relationships of evil, the relationship of evil, the number of evil, the numbers of evil, the number of evil, the formula of evil, the formulas of evil, the formula of evil, the equation of evil, the equations of evil, the equation of evil, the theory of evil, the theories of evil, the theory of evil, the symbol of evil, the symbols of evil, the symbol of evil, the color of evil, the colors of evil, the color of evil, the thing of evil, the things of evil, the thing of evil, the way of evil, the ways of evil, the way of evil, the place of evil, the places of evil, the place of evil, the time of evil, the times of evil, the time of evil, the event of evil, the events of evil, the event of evil, the result of evil, the results of evil, the result of evil, the crown of evil, the crowns of evil, the crown of evil, the throne of evil, the thrones of evil, the throne of evil, the evil king, the evil kings, the evil kingdom, the evil kingdoms, the evil king's subject, the evil king's subjects, the evil king's dominion, the evil king's dominions, the kingdom of evil, the kingdoms of evil, the kingdom of evil, the evil queen, the evil queens, the evil queendom, the evil queendoms, the evil queen's subject, the evil queen's subjects, the evil queen's dominion, the evil queen's dominions, the queendom of evil, the queendoms of evil, the queendom of evil, the evil prince, the evil princes, the evil princedom, the evil princedoms, the evil prince's subject, the evil prince's subjects, the evil prince's dominion, the evil prince's dominions, the princedom of evil, the princedoms of evil, the princedom of evil, the evil princess, the evil princesses, the evil princessdom, the evil princessdoms, the evil princess's subject, the evil princess's subjects, the evil princess's dominion, the evil princess's dominions, the princessdom of evil, the princessdoms of evil, the princessdom of evil, the lord of evil, the lords of evil, the lord of evil, the lordess of evil, The lordess is of evil. The lordess of evil, the priest of evil. The priests of evil. The priest of evil, the priestess of evil. The priestesses of evil. The priestess of evil, the ritual of evil. The rituals of evil. The ritual of evil, the shrine of evil. The shrines of evil. The shrine of evil, the temple of evil. The temples of evil. The temple of evil, the leader of evil. The leaders of evil. The leader of evil, the follower of evil. The followers of evil. The follower of evil, the natural substance of evil. The natural substances of evil. The natural substance of evil, the supernatural substance of evil. The supernatural substances of evil. The supernatural substance of evil, the temporal substance of evil. The temporal substances of evil. The temporal substance of evil, the spiritual substance of evil. The spiritual substances of evil. The spiritual substance of evil, the natural form of evil. The natural forms of evil. The natural form of evil, the supernatural form of evil. The supernatural forms of evil. The supernatural form of evil, the temporal form of evil. The temporal forms of evil. The temporal form of evil, the spiritual form of evil. The spiritual forms of evil. The spiritual form of evil, the age of evil. The ages of evil. The age of evil, the era of evil. The heiress of evil. The era of evil, the awakener of evil. The awakeners of evil. The awakener of evil, the awakening of evil. The awakenings of evil. The awakening of evil, the realm of evil. The realms of evil. The realm of evil, the dimension of evil. The dimensions of evil. The dimension of evil, the zone of evil. The zones of evil. The zone of evil, the frequency of evil. The frequencies of evil. The frequency of evil, the century of evil. The centuries of evil. The century of evil, the millennium of evil. The millenniums of evil. The millennium of evil, the purpose of evil. The purposes of evil. The purpose of evil, the meaning of evil. The meanings of evil. The meaning of evil, the culture of evil. The cultures of evil. The culture of evil, the demonstrator of evil. The demonstrators of evil. The demonstrator of evil, the demonstration of evil. The demonstrations of evil. The demonstration of evil, the manifester of evil. The manifestors of evil. The manifester of evil, the manifestation of evil. The manifestations of evil. The manifestation of evil, the presence of evil. The presences of evil. The presence of evil, the glow of evil. The glows of evil. The glow of evil, the goal of evil. The goals of evil. The goal of evil, the plan of evil. The plans of evil. The plan of evil, the book of evil. The books of evil. The book of evil, the philosopher of evil. The philosophers of evil. The philosopher of evil, the philosophy of evil. The philosophies of evil. The philosophy of evil, the releaser of evil. The releasers of evil. The releaser of evil, the release of evil. The releases of evil. The release of evil, the variable of evil. The variables of evil. The variable of evil, the cause of evil. The causes of evil. The cause of evil, the effect of evil. The effects of evil. The effect of evil, the journey of evil. The journeys of evil. The journey of evil, the emergence of evil. The emergences of evil. The emergence of evil, the source of evil. The sources of evil. The source of evil, the originator of evil. The originators of evil. The originator of evil, the origin of evil. The origins of evil. The origin of evil, the forefather of evil. The forefathers of evil. The forefather of evil, the foremother of evil. The foremothers of evil. The foremother of evil, the ancestor of evil. The ancestors of evil. The ancestor of evil, the descendant of evil. The descendants of evil. The descendant of evil, the lineage of evil. The lineages of evil. The lineage of evil, the heritage of evil. The heritages of evil. The heritage of evil, the heir of evil. The heirs of evil. The heir of evil, the co-heir of evil. The co-heirs of evil. The co-heir of evil, the joint heir of evil. The joint heirs of evil. The joint heir of evil, the dynasty of evil. The dynasties of evil. The dynasty of evil, the force of evil. The forces of evil. The force of evil, the law of evil. The laws of evil. the law of evil, the pact of evil, the pacts of evil, the pact of evil, the game of evil, the games of evil, the game of evil, the mask of evil, the masks of evil, the mask of evil, the armor of evil, the armors of evil, the armor of evil, the sword of evil, the swords of evil, the sword of evil, the shield of evil, the shields of evil, the shield of evil, the force shield of evil, the force shields of evil, the force shield of evil, the armored force shield of evil, the armored force shields of evil, the armored force shield of evil, the champion of evil, the champions of evil, the champion of evil, the guardian of evil, the guardians of evil, the guardian of evil, the defender of evil, the defenders of evil, the defender of evil, the protector of evil, the protectors of evil, the protector of evil, the chant of evil, the chants of evil, the chant of evil, the shape of evil, the shapes of evil, the shape of evil, the cube of evil, the cubes of evil, the cube of evil, the cuboid of evil, the cuboids of evil, the cuboid of evil, the sphere of evil, the spheres of evil, the sphere of evil, the spheroid of evil, the spheroids of evil, the spheroid of evil, the prism of evil, the prisms of evil, the prism of evil, the pyramid of evil, the pyramids of evil, the pyramid of evil, the cylinder of evil, the cylinders of evil, the cylinder of evil, the cone of evil, the cones of evil, the cone of evil, the triangle of evil, the triangles of evil, the triangle of evil, the circle of evil, the circles of evil, the circle of evil, the semicircle of evil, the semicircles of evil, the semicircle of evil, the square of evil, the squares of evil, the square of evil, the rectangle of evil, the rectangles of evil, the rectangle of evil, the parallelogram of evil, the parallelograms of evil, the parallelogram of evil, the rhombus of evil, the rhombuses of evil, the rhombus of evil, the trapezoid of evil, the trapezoids of evil, the trapezoid of evil, the polygon of evil, the polygons of evil, the polygon of evil, the pentagon of evil, the pentagons of evil, the pentagon of evil, the hexagon of evil, the hexagons of evil, the hexagon of evil, the septagon of evil, the septagons of evil, the septagon of evil, the octagon of evil, the octagons of evil, the octagon of evil, the nonagon of evil, the nonagons of evil, the nonagon of evil, the decagon of evil, the decagons of evil, the decagon of evil, the evolution of evil, the evolutions of evil, the evolution of evil, the revolution of evil, the revolutions of evil, the revolution of evil, the elemental art of evil, the elemental arts of evil, the elemental art of evil, the elemental science of evil, the elemental sciences of evil, the elemental science of evil, the elemental principle of evil, the elemental principles of evil, the elemental principle of evil, the elemental technology of evil, the elemental technologies of evil, the elemental technology of evil, the low elemental art of evil, the low elemental arts of evil, the low elemental art of evil, the low elemental science of evil, the low elemental sciences of evil, the low elemental science of evil, the low elemental principle of evil, the low elemental principles of evil, the low elemental principle of evil, the low elemental technology of evil, the low elemental technologies of evil, the low elemental technology of evil, the high elemental art of evil, the high elemental arts of evil, the high elemental art of evil, the high elemental science of evil, the high elemental sciences of evil, the high elemental science of evil, the high elemental principle of evil, the high elemental principles of evil, the high elemental principle of evil, the high elemental technology of evil, the high elemental technologies of evil, the high elemental technology of evil, the agent of evil, the agents of evil, the agent of evil, the agency of evil, the agencies of evil, the agency of evil, the amplifier of evil, the amplifiers of evil, the amplifier of evil, the amplification of evil, the amplifications of evil, the amplification of evil, the enhancer of evil, the enhancers of evil, the enhancer of evil, the enhancement of evil, the enhancements of evil, the enhancement of evil, the magnifier of evil, the magnifiers of evil, the magnifier of evil, the magnification of evil, the magnifications of evil, the magnification of evil, the influencer of evil, the influencers of evil, the influencer of evil, the influence of evil, the influences of evil, the influence of evil, the emanator of evil, the emanators of evil, the emanator of evil, the emanation of evil, the emanations of evil, the emanation of evil, the converger of evil, the convergers of evil, the converger of evil, the convergence of evil, the convergences of evil, the convergence of evil, the aura of evil, the auras of evil, the aura of evil, the impression of evil, the impressions of evil, the impression of evil, the intelligence of evil, the intelligences of evil, the intelligence of evil, the sophistication of evil, the sophistications of evil, the sophistication of evil, the genius of evil, the geniuses of evil, the genius of evil, the polymath of evil, the polymaths of evil, the polymath of evil, the psychic of evil, the psychics of evil, the psychic of evil, the knowledge of evil, the knowledges of evil, the knowledge of evil, the understanding of evil, the understandings of evil, the understanding of evil, the wisdom of evil, the wisdoms of evil, the wisdom of evil, the secret of evil, the secrets of evil, the secret of evil, the mystery of evil, the mysteries of evil, the mystery of evil, the revelation of evil, the revelations of evil, the revelation of evil, the tactic of evil, the tactics of evil, the tactic of evil, the strategy of evil, the strategies of evil, the strategy of evil, the strength of evil, the strengths of evil, the strength of evil, the might of evil, the mights of evil, the might of evil, the power of evil, the powers of evil, the power of evil, the authority of evil, the authorities of evil, the authority of evil, the dominion of evil, the dominions of evil, the dominion of evil, the rhythm of evil, the rhythms of evil, the rhythm of evil, the melody of evil, the melodies of evil, the melody of evil, the music of evil, the musics of evil, the music of evil, the lyric of evil, the lyrics of evil, the lyric of evil, the song of evil, the songs of evil, the song of evil, the dance of evil, the dances of evil, the dance of evil, the spirit of evil, the spirits of evil, the spirit of evil, the soul of evil, the souls of evil, the soul of evil, the body of evil, the bodies of evil, the body of evil, the mark of evil, the marks of evil, the mark of evil, the promise of evil, the promises of evil, the promise of evil, the visionary of evil, the visionaries of evil, the visionary of evil, the vision of evil, the visions of evil, the vision of evil, the picture of evil, the pictures of evil, the picture of evil, the sound of evil, the sounds of evil, the sound of evil, the dung of evil, the dungs of evil, the dung of evil, the language of evil, the languages of evil, the language of evil, the communication of evil, the communications of evil, the communication of evil, the people of evil, the peoples of evil, the people of evil, the society of evil, the societies of evil, the society of evil, the fortress of evil, the fortresses of evil, the fortress of evil, the government of evil, the governments of evil, the government of evil, the city of evil, the cities of evil, the city of evil, the nation of evil, the nations of evil, the nation of evil, the civilization of evil, the civilizations of evil, the civilization of evil, the world of evil, the worlds of evil, the world of evil,